trong cái vấn đề họp hành để thảo luận về vấn đề ăn uống liên hệ tới sức khỏe. Đây là cái tài liệu nói về những cái dấu hiệu về những cái thức ăn mà nó ảnh hưởng tới sức khỏe của con người. Do ông bác sĩ Hyman là người đứng ra trực tiếp thảo luận với cái nhóm này. Thành ra tôi thâu đoạn ngắn, và với tư cách của người Việt Nam, chúng tôi sẽ đề nghị với quý vị mình nên ăn uống như thế nào để sức khỏe tốt và vui hưởng những cái gì mình đang có trên thế gian này. Xin mời quý vị theo dõi ạ.
Now, most people kind of get inflammation. Well, I have a sore throat. Okay, that's inflammation. Or, you know, I have an autoimmune disease. Or I have allergies. Or I have asthma. People sort of get that's inflammation. But most people don't really know that other diseases that I mentioned, like heart disease, cancer, obesity, diabetes, aging itself, depression, autism, are all either caused by or somehow affected by inflammation in our bodies. And by the way, just to say, everybody, the reason why Americans were only 4% of the population but suffered 16% of the cases and deaths from COVID was not because we have a bad healthcare system. It's because we were all pre-inflamed, because we were living and eating and doing things in a way that make us pre-inflamed. So when COVID hits us, it starts a wildfire. It's like dropping a match in a dry forest, you know. So it creates a wildfire, and that's exactly what COVID was. It was a wildfire in our bodies that killed so many of us. So kind of take us through why are we having so much inflammation, and what is it? How do we kind of identify it?
Sure. Well, just going back to the basics, inflammation is actually an ancestral force that evolved to protect us from things like pathogens and poisons and traumas, all of these ancient killers. So it's actually a good thing in our bodies to have inflammation when we need it. But the problem is that because we've evolved these strong, robust immune responses, we also tend to pay a price for it, and this is called the biological price of having a strong immune system. And we can see that with autoimmune diseases, for example, like rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory bowel disease. But now what we're seeing is that we've also transformed our modern environment, from the food we eat to the air we breathe to how we move, how we interact with others in terms of social connections. So our immune systems are constantly triggered at a low level, and this leads to chronic silent inflammation in the body. And we know today that this type of inflammation can actually be an independent cause of disease, and it is tied to a variety of modern chronic diseases. The majority of our top killers tied to heart disease, cancer, diabetes, neurodegenerative disorders, some psychiatric issues, obesity. So what we're seeing today is that the majority of us in the modern world are inflamed.
Yeah. Most people don't walk around going, oh, I'm inflamed. Like if you got a rash or you have a sore throat, you know I'm inflamed, right? If you have arthritis in your knee and it's swollen up, you go, I got a problem. But most people who are overweight or heart disease or high blood pressure or diabetes or depression, they're not walking around thinking, oh, I'm inflamed, I better deal with that, right?
Right, absolutely.
So explain how inflammation plays.
Tất cả con người ai cũng bị những cái bệnh đấy, những cái bệnh nào ca phát huyết, nào là mập, rồi nào là bệnh này bệnh nọ, ung thư rồi này đó. Tất cả cái đó là do nơi cái hệ miễn nhiễm của người ta nó yếu rồi. Mà muốn cho cái hệ miễn nhiễm nó quay trở lại tốt, thành là mình phải để ý những cái thức ăn để nó giúp cho cái hệ miễn nhiễm, cái hormone của mình, rồi nó để cho cơ thể mình các bộ phận nó chống lại cái bệnh xâm nhập trong cơ thể của mình. Đấy, ta đoạn ngắn nha.
Oh, to know all of these modern chronic disorders. And you're right that if you go into the doctor's office, your typical Western physician's office, you're unlikely to be offered a test for inflammation. So the question is, how exactly do you know that you're inflamed? And I think there are a lot of things that are coming up these days. For example, in cardiology clinics, doctors might test you for something called C-reactive protein, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, and that's a marker of inflammation in the body. It's made in the liver in response to areas of inflammation. And there are a variety of other markers as well, but some of the problems with these tests is that they may not be that specific. So if you have elevated C-reactive protein, you may have that elevation from the cold you have, and you cannot be sure where it's coming from in your body, how long it's been there for. But, there are new markers being developed. There are inflammatory signatures, for example. There was a Stanford study a couple of years ago on aging, and an inflammatory signature comprised of several markers that can help to predict healthy aging. And, there are so many different things that are in the works, I think, from tests like CAT scans and MRIs that can pick up inflammation around blood vessels, for example, and predict which plaques are most likely to rupture. So those are some of the things. And one of the proxies for being inflamed that we can all look at when we go to a primary care physician's office is just, things like high blood sugar or diabetes. If you have pre-diabetes or diabetes, you're most likely to have some amount of inflammation in the body, because high blood sugar does tend to create inflammation. And if you have that belly fat, for example, then you also know that you most likely have some level of inflammation in the body, because we know that the belly fat is a marker for the fat that wraps around your internal abdominal organs.
Yeah, I mean, that by the way, that fat, right, is a source of a lot of inflammation, because it's not just, the belly fat is not just holding up your pants. It's actually a very active immune hormonal organ that's spewing out all kinds of inflammatory signals if you get this excess belly fat. And I think most people don't realize that. If you have a big belly, you've got a smoldering fire inside of you. And that is really important to understand. And the reason we get the big belly is because of what we're eating. So, let's talk about, some of the things we were talking about, like how do we know, right? So we can do a CRP, but it's not very specific. It doesn't tell us why. There are other markers. You mentioned Stanford research. I think that was David Furman's work on the 1,000 Immunomes project, where he looked at cytokines or inflammatory markers in 1,000 people, from little kids to old people, and he found they were like things that we probably never heard about in medical school. These cytokines that that we don't test for in a normal lab result, but that actually are probably more predictive and more correlated with various age-related diseases than other markers that we actually do measure, right? So we're sort of learning about how to test for this. And you mentioned high-resolution scans, imaging tests. Now, for example, with Alzheimer's, we know that Alzheimer's is an inflammation in the brain. We can see through various MRI and high-technology scans, we can see inflammation in the brain. We can see, for example, in new AI-driven heart scans, we can see inflamed plaque, where rather than just looking at, an angiogram or even calcium score, which gives you a rough idea of the calcified plaque, doesn't tell you how inflamed your plaque is. So we're getting more and more sophisticated. But are there tests that we should all be doing to check for inflammation? And are there tests that help us figure out the why? Like, what is the why behind why we're so inflamed?
I think it's certainly a tough question, for sure, and I think it's also very specialty dependent. For example, in my own.
Cảm ơn quý vị đã dành thời giờ quý báu theo dõi một đoạn ngắn video này, và tôi sẽ phổ biến nhiều tài liệu để nghiên cứu về sức khỏe. Đặc biệt ở đây người ta nói về cái vấn đề dịch coronavirus vừa rồi, là số người ra đi ở trên thế giới nhiều lắm, mà ở Mỹ cũng nhiều lắm nha. Thành ra cái đó là tại vì vừa sợ quá rồi lo quá rồi nó sanh ra nhiều chuyện lắm. Dạ, thành ra kính chúc quý vị vui vẻ và bình an. Dạ.
But I think we're getting there, and I